Hello and welcome back to Pictorial on Relay FM. I'm Quinn Rose, and I didn't go to art school, but I still love to learn about art, and so I do it here every episode.
And I'm Betty. I also didn't go to art school, but I also love learning about art, and today I'm going to be talking about a bunch of people who also never went to art school, but are amazing anyway.
Ooh, my favorite.
Yeah, I think this is quite a fitting topic for us because, yeah, again, like we're quite often talking about what it's like to be outside of the art world. And these people that we're going to get into today are very much, or at least used to be very much outside of the mainstream art world. They are awesome, in my opinion anyway, and hopefully I can help convince everybody else that's the case too.
So who are we talking about today?
Today, we're talking about a group of artists that's collectively known as the Florida Highwaymen, or simply known as the Highwaymen. Now, the caveat is they weren't all men. One of them was a woman. But anyway, this was the name that was. They didn't name themselves this. Somebody else kind of gave them that name. I'll get into that sort of when I go through their origins. But before I get into it, have you heard of these people before? Or is this like totally, and it's totally okay if you haven't, because again, these people are not mainstream.
Yeah, I have not heard of these artists before. Really excited to hear more about them, and especially like how they got their name if they didn't name themselves that.
Yeah, exactly. I guess before I get started, I popped a link in the show notes, which is an example of one of the artist's paintings, and there's a diverse amount of styles, but I say this painting is kind of representative of the type of work they were creating, and I just wanted to get your kind of initial reaction on like what you think of this painting.
Yeah, this is a pretty straightforward painting, I would say. It's fairly realistic. I think at first glance, you might think this is a photo, but it is a landscape painting of a sunset. The sky is gorgeous. There's lots of orange and red in the clouds, but it's over the top of a lake with lots of trees peeking out of the lake, and it's just this really pretty nature painting.
So this is actually a untitled and undated painting by one of the Highwaymen called Harold Newton, and it's as far as we know, it's kind of like a typical Florida backcountry sunset scene on the waterfront. And it is very beautiful, and it apparently, like, I've been to Florida a few times, but according to what I've looked up, if you live in Florida, especially if you live sort of in the more, I guess, like country rural side of Florida, more so between the 50s and the 70s, this would have been like a typical sunset scene that you could see like outside of your house, or if you lived on the waterfront. And so, but it's obviously painted in kind of like a more vivid, striking type of way. Anyway, so I'll kind of give an overview about these artists. So the Highwaymen is composed of 26 artists, at least officially, and 25 of them are men, and one of them is a woman. And they're basically known for painting Florida's landscapes. They started doing it in the 1950s, but they kind of did that prolifically until the 1970s, which is kind of when they dropped off. But then these artists started creating works again from the 90s all the way up until now. They created all kinds of paintings, but mostly it's described kind of as paintings of like undisturbed wilderness, like palm trees and, like coastal waters, marshes, like ocean waves, tropical sunsets, similar to the painting I just showed you. Yeah, a lot of paintings that depict Florida's landscape. And one thing that's interesting is apparently a lot of the landscapes in these paintings have actually largely disappeared over the years because of urban development. And so, like, in a way, it's kind of like a documentation of what Florida used to look like, but unfortunately no longer in many cases because humans. So these paintings are, like, I'll say now, like, they're tremendously popular. Sort of when you first looked at it, you can kind of see why in a way, because it is quite beautiful. And it probably is also interesting to a lot of people because it does depict these landscapes that no longer exist. There's more interesting aspects of these artists than just the subject matter. They were really prolific. There's an estimated 200,000 works that were just created between the 1950s and 70s. And since then, they've created even more. What I should probably mention that I haven't yet is all of these artists are Black. And when they were painting these artworks at the time, all of them were rejected from any galleries or any places that's like a traditional art institution. So they had to basically sell their own art themselves in order to, get these works out there. It wasn't until the 90s when like a series of publications in these pretty prominent art magazines were written about them, that they became more widely known outside of Florida. And the person who designated the Highwaymen name to them is this writer called Jim Finch. And the reason he called them the Florida Highwaymen is, one, it's probably just like a really catchy title, kind of like you mentioned earlier. Like it's like people are like, oh, like what's that? But yeah, it's also literally because they drove up and down the Florida highways selling their paintings, like I-95 or like Highway 1 or whatever, these major highways. And apparently they were just like, they had their cars, like were just pulling people over, I'm assuming, and selling their works. So that's kind of a gist of who they are. But what I do want to talk about and get into a little bit is how they became so popular. Like it really was, they had to overcome a lot in order to like make a living and get their artworks out there because of the location as well as the era they were living in at the time.
This is such a fascinating little piece of history, and especially the breakdown of where their name actually came from and them actually like selling paintings on the highway is so fascinating. And I'm also I'm very interested to hear about how this became kind of a formalized group, because I was surprised to hear you say this is like 25 people, because that's a lot more than I was expecting. And I'm very curious to, and especially like this isn't just like an art style or whatever, like this is a connected group of people. And so I'm very interested to hear about like how they connected with each other and how this group became formalized, like what defines someone as a member of the Florida Highwaymen.
You actually asked a really great question. And what I'll say kind of off the bat, like before I get into their origins, is that they would themselves consider themselves not formalized. They would just say, we're just a group of people who are friends who happen to know each other and painted together and helped each other sell art. And the designation of exactly who these 26 people are, again, came from an outside source, like so similarly to Jim Finch, who designated them as the Highwaymen, this writer named Gary Monroe did extensive research into these artists, and he was the one who determined who the 26 people are. And actually, over the years, there's been other people, as well as the artists themselves, who either dispute to say they shouldn't be on the list or other people should be on the list. But like all things, it's vague and it's difficult to determine, exactly who's right and who's wrong, because really they're kind of just like a loose group of people who kind of like met up by chance and then ended up becoming artists.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. Of course, I mean, all things are always messier than they are in the headlines, but it does make a lot of sense that the actual truth of the matter is a little messier than perhaps some people on the outside wanted it to be.
Yeah, for sure. So the gist of the origins of how they started as a group of artists or a group of painters is that in the early 1950s, there was this kid, like a 14-year-old kid named Alfred Hare. Somehow he got to know this really well-known painter called A.E. Bean Backus, who was a professionally trained landscape painter. And they were I think they were friends. And then so Backus ended up kind of mentoring, or he saw the talent in Alfred Hare in terms of like, you know, that he thinks he's, even though he was a 14-year-old kid, he had a talent for painting. So he kind of mentored Hare into like landscape painting practices. And apparently Hare was also friends with this other guy who was the person who painted the painting in the beginning I showed you, called Harold Newton, who also trained under Bacchus. So the two of them are probably the only people in this group of 26 people who you could say had any like level of professional training, but it's not formal. Like it's not like they went to a art school because they probably couldn't afford to and also wouldn't be accepted at the time anyway. But it just so happens they knew this guy who was a landscape painter who was a really nice person who would teach them how to paint. This was kind of how like the two of them sort of started this group, although they didn't originally intend for it to be a group. They kind of just started painting and were like, hey, let's sell our art. It just so happens that Alfred Hare, like not only was he somebody who like eventually became a really good painter, he also throughout this entire thing was proven to be just like a really good businessman in terms of like, you know, how to sell and promote art. Basically what happened is he just ended up hiring a bunch of people to help him with things like frame making, like, you know, painting and like selling. And then eventually the group grew larger and larger, and all of them were like painting and selling art, you know, by like the 60s and 70s.
Wow. Okay.
As I mentioned before, so this was during what is known as the Jim Crow era in the South. And at the time, most African Americans, they worked in places like citrus groves and tomato fields and factories. And I believe most of these artists themselves worked in places like the groves and the fields. And, you know, they were making like very minimum, well, not even minimum, very low wages, basically, that basically was very difficult to make for them to make a living. And a lot of them decided to take up painting because this was an additional way to make money and possibly a way for them to get out of like, you know, doing very terribly difficult manual labor in horrid conditions while being paid next to nothing. But anyway, so because they couldn't sell art in traditional institutions or libraries, as I mentioned before, they sold their art on the highway. But what it is that they sold their art for like really low prices. So for instance, like Bacchus, their teacher, like he would sell his paintings for $250, but they would only sell theirs for $25. But in order to make up the difference, they basically just painted prolifically, like nonstop. And they did a bunch of like, I believe it was Hare who kind of like pioneered a bunch of like techniques. Like he had this technique called fast painting, where he kind of created an assembly line technique where he would pin up like 20 boards in his backyard, and then he would mix one color at a time, and then he would like go to the boards and just paint skies with like blue. And then he would just paint the ground with whatever the ground color is.
Wow.
And then he would go through and just paint the trees. And he would also do this really fast, similar to how Impressionists do it. It became this like assembly line mechanism. And then, as I mentioned before, eventually he got like his wife and his family members, his brother-in-law, his friends to become a part of this assembly line, you know, so that they can basically churn out like 20 to 100 paintings a day, depending on how many people showed up to help.
That is so smart. And I could just visualize that. I would love to see like footage of that process.
Really interesting. And again, like, and in addition to that, like he was using like cheap material. Apparently all the paintings were oil paint, but they were painted on this type of board called Upson board, which is a medium density fiber board used for like in buildings, but it's really cheap. And of course it's easy to paint on as well. So, and then apparently they also made their own frames. They would use crown molding, again, from like leftover construction material, and just like these like really cheap like scrapped wood pieces that they would salvage to make these paintings. So it's like the combination of cheap material and just incredibly efficient labor that like made it so that they basically produced probably something like 10 times or more as many paintings as like a traditional painter, so that they make up for the difference of the fact that they're selling their art for 1/10 the price. I put 3 examples of artworks that they were doing like back in the 60s when they were doing this fast painting process. Like the first one is by Alfred Hare, so kind of like the de facto leader of the group. The second one is by actually his brother-in-law, who's called Carnell Smith. And then the third one is by Marianne Carroll, who's the only female member of the group. I think the thing that I think is interesting to realize is that even though they were doing these like kind of fast assembly line processes, that seems like they're, kind of like, it sounds like kind of like they're cheating the process. But the thing is, these artworks, at least from what I can see, all came out beautifully. Like apparently, even though he was doing them in a systematic way, all of these paintings came out like unique. Like there was no 2 works that looked the same. And it was kind of a way for them to explore their creativity as well. I'm not sure like what your opinion is. Like some of these are more like impressionistic and rougher than others. But I look at these and I'm like, I cannot believe these were done. 20 of these were churned out a day, because I couldn't do one of these if I had like 6 months.
Yeah, I fully feel like you're punking me right now. Like it is... So we look at the first one is another sunset, or I guess it could be sunrise, but I'm assuming it's sunset because I never see the sunrise. But anyway, over the beach on the ocean. The second one is more impressionistic, and it's like of a little house on a beach with palm trees. And then the third one is, I think, my favorite of these 3. It's so cool looking. It's like you have this tree on it's more vertical painting, and there's this tree coming up the right side of the painting, kind of creeping up around the top right hand corner. Looking past the tree, you have the sight of a lake, and it looks like it might be kind of like a nighttime shot where the moon is shining in the sky. It's so cool looking. And even with the middle one, which I do say is more impressionist than the other 2, there's still an incredible amount of detail in all of them. And in these pictures that you sent me, like you can, especially with the link to the first beach painting, you can zoom right up into these brushstrokes, and it creates a gorgeous level of detail and texture in this painting that if you told me this took, full, I don't know how long paintings take to do. I was about to like say, oh, this took like a full week. And I'm like, is that a long time for a painting? A full month, maybe? I am not an artist. Yeah. But anyway, I would believe you if you told me this took a long time to paint. It feels so much more unbelievable to say this was done in an assembly line of 20 a day.
Yeah. And I think like some of these probably took longer than others. But the point is like these, as far as I can tell, like in my research, most of these were done in like less than a day. Like maybe some of the more complex ones took longer, but because I read even that one of the group's members, whose name is Al Black, he said he was like selling some of these artworks while the paint was still wet. Like,
oh my gosh.
Like they would paint 20 in a day and give it to Al, and like he would put in his car. And because they used these like construction crown moldings, he could stack them while the paint's drying. And yeah, and like he would go and like sell all of them. What's interesting is I do actually also agree. Like my favorite out of these 3 is probably the one you described, that nighttime one with the tree peeking over the side. That one is by Marianne Carroll. And I'm not just biased because she's the only woman, but I do think she probably has some of the best paintings out of like I mean, they're all amazing, but hers, I think, are especially gorgeous. Mary Ann Carroll, like, she was never formally trained. She apparently always loved drawing, and she met Harold Newton, and apparently the story is Harold Newton also painted on his car, and I came across him one day and I was like, oh, I like the flames you drew on your car. And Newton's like, I like the flames on your car. And Newton was like, oh, I drew it myself. Do you want to learn like how to paint? And then he kind of just like, taught her. And according to the sources I read, after like within weeks, she was like painting and then like selling art. So she had 7 children and she was a single mother. So she also was one of these people. I think she immediately was like, I need to, this is a way to make money. And this is a way for me, to be able to support my family. So it's probably also why she was like, I'm just going to churn out as many of these paintings as possible so I can sell as many as possible.
Wow. I'm glad that she found this collective. And I mean, but it couldn't have been easy to be the only woman in this sort of in this collective. And so I admire her for being able to hold her own and to establish herself among that.
We definitely don't have time to get into all 26 artists, but the stories of almost all of these artists and how they started painting are all really interesting. That second picture of the impressionistic one of the house is like I mentioned, is by Carnell Smith, who's Alfred Hare's brother-in-law. And he started with, Hare was just like, hey, can you help me just paint the backgrounds? Like, it's really easy. You just do the sky and the water. You just paint like swaths of blue. And so he started out kind of as an assistant. And then 3 years later, he too was just doing his own landscapes and like all kinds of other things like these houses. I mentioned earlier Al Black. So he apparently was just this really good sales guy. So they hired him as a salesman. And then what happened was, like I mentioned, the paint would still be wet. And sometimes when he's transporting them, parts would get smudged. So he had to learn how to mix paint to fix some of these paintings while he's on the road. So through learning how to fix them, he learned how to paint. And he then was just like, all right, I'm going to do my own paintings.
What a fun way to learn how to paint. Wait, talk about trial by fire. I mean, having to figure out how to mix paints to match a color and to fix the smudge in a painting, like while a customer's standing there, that's amazing. Like, no wonder he learned quickly and became a great artist in this group.
Yeah. And so anyway, like I was looking into, kind of how and why they became popular, like even, or how they managed to sell all these paintings. There are some theories to why, but it really just seemed like a lot of people just really, especially people in Florida, were just like really drawn to these works. They were like, because they were representing like the landscape, like and what they saw every day, and they're of course just done in these like really beautiful and vivid colors. These works ended up in like churches, like offices, beauty salons, like lawyers and doctors' offices, and like motels, and just basically all kinds of places. And again, like there were 200,000 that were produced during this time. And what happened was, unfortunately, in 1970, this was kind of at the height of their careers, and they were selling paintings like mad. Unfortunately, there was an incident where Alfred Hare, he was at a local bar, and he got into apparently some sort of like conflict or confrontation with someone, and he was shot and killed at age 29.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously it's really sad. He was only 29 and like so young and so talented, but not only was it sad like that he passed away, because of this, the group kind of just fell apart, because he really was the leader of this group. Because again, not other people, they were just farm workers who didn't really know how to run a business, for lack of a better term. And he was really the only person who knew how to keep that together. So yeah, by 1980, kind of most of them just weren't able to sell their works anymore or stop painting altogether. And like I said, it wasn't until the 90s when there was this renewed interest in their works that they became more widely known throughout the rest of the United States. And some of them started painting again because they realized, they were able to sell their works again. But this time, instead of selling for $25, it was like $5,000 or $10,000 or more. Today, though, so I did read that a lot of their works actually now sell for up to tens of thousands of dollars, and probably, some of the more like rare and older ones could go for even higher. In 2004, the group was inducted to the Florida Artists Hall of Fame. And in 2011, Michelle Obama actually invited Marianne Carroll to the White House to present one of her paintings. And there's actually an interview with her where she's just like, oh my God, I cannot believe this is happening. How is this my life? Obviously she was just like, I was just painting and selling artworks on the side of the highway. And then in 2011, she was in the White House.
Wow.
That's kind of like an overview of their career and how they developed this business and how they got their artworks out there. And because of these renewed interests in the 90s and probably even now, I would say ever since the 90s, there's been this interest in what's called folk art or outsider art, which are usually art that's reflective of the cultural life of a community, but it's generally rejected by traditional art institutions and mainstream art galleries and places like that. There's more interest in these, alternative non-mainstream work by more people, which is really great for these artists who were kind of underappreciated. But I think what is still interesting to think about is, despite the fact that, we look at these paintings or these are beautiful and amazing, folk art and artworks like this is still to this day deemed by, kind of academic institutions as not as valuable as, traditional art of people who are traditionally trained. So there is still there's still always this stigma that this is just folk art. This is done by people who are non-professional.
The fairly abrupt end to this group in terms of their de facto leader really tragically dying young, and then things not really keeping up after his death is so sad. And I am glad to hear that they have been recognized more in the decades since, and that people have gone back and done at least some amount of correction of the record there and saying oh, okay, these were really interesting artists and they do deserve to be remembered and talked about and commemorated in ways as little as this podcast or as big as the White House. But also the whole point you ended that with the way that big establishments decide what is and isn't worthy of recognition is such an ongoing problem. It's such a self-perpetuating problem because, we don't talk about anyone on this podcast who isn't recognized by some art museum in some way because we don't know about other people because we're don't work in art and we so it's just but you see the way that even though I think that both of us in this podcast has an extremely strong stance of believing in a very wide definition of art and believing that these certain types of art are so under-recognized, even we lack the ability to recognize a lot of those because the structures that be don't. And so it's such a self-perpetuating cycle, which is really sad.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, what is kind of good about at least this group of artists, is that because of this recognition, their artworks have gotten into some museums. They are represented in a bunch of Florida art and art history museums, and there are 18 of their works in the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. So it is possible for us to see them or for in public collections, which is good because the majority of their artworks are in private collections, although certain collectors have been kind of donating them or loaning them to museums kind of around the US. So The other thing that is great for these artists, like having recognition, is that they kind of, ever since the 90s, they no longer have to do this fast assembly line type of situation. A lot of them have been able to take more time to develop more detailed and larger works. And so at the bottom of the show notes, I just kind of gave like 3 examples of artworks that were done by one of them is Carnell Smith. So you'll remember the really sketchy impressionistic house, but now he's able to do he's actually, unfortunately since then has passed away, but at this time he was able to do more detailed paintings. And then another one is an example of a work that was done by Marianne Carroll in 2019. And then the third one is an example of a work that was done by Chico Wheeler, who and this work was painted in 2010. So as far as I know, based on my research, 9 out of the 26 Highwaymen are still alive, and I think all of them but one, as far as 2019, are still painting to this day. Most of them are in their 70s and 80s, but they're still painting and they're still selling their artworks, but now they can do it in more detail and take more time doing them.
Wow, I am so glad to hear that the ones who are still alive, and hopefully the ones who have passed away, like up until that point, are, still in art and still doing that work and now have the chance to actually get some more compensation for it. I do have to say real quick, when you said earlier, like, oh, at least, hundreds of thousands of paintings or whatever are in private collections. It's interesting because I feel like most of the time when you hear like, oh, all of their work is in private collections, it's really tragic because that usually means like 10 rich people. But this means like actually just the entire population of Florida like has these paintings in their home. That's kind of more the vibe. And that while, of course, I'm sure tons of them have been lost or destroyed or just, misplaced over the years because there are just so many in circulation, it's also really cool to think about like how many just ordinary people probably have these paintings in their homes.
That is a really good point. Because again, like unlike these, traditional artworks that we've talked about before, these types of works are more accessible to, common average everyday people. Because again, they're, that was their market. That was who they were selling to. I'm sure around Florida, there's still places that have these artworks like in doctors' offices and beauty salons. One thing I will mention is that most of these artworks are signed, but some are actually unsigned. So I don't know if you after hearing this podcast want to start collecting Highwaymen paintings, just make sure you're actually getting an authentic one.
Hey, good point.
Yeah. And the only other thing I'll mention is that there have been two PBS documentaries that have been made about them if you want to learn more. One of them is called The Highwaymen, Florida's Outsider Artists from 2003. And the other one is called The Highwaymen, Legends of the Road. So I think they're hour-long documentaries, and there are interviews with some of the Highwaymen who were still alive at the time, including Marianne Carroll. So some additional resources if people are interested.
There are so many great links in the show notes this week from all the pictures of everything we talked about today and those further resources to check out. So definitely go check out our show notes at relay.fm/pictorial. You can also find us on Twitter or Instagram at PictorialPod. And you can also find me on Instagram at AspiringRobotFM.
And you can also find me on Twitter or Instagram at ArticulationsV, and I am also on YouTube as Articulations. And speaking of YouTube, we also have a YouTube channel, Pictorial Podcast, where you can watch some of our podcasts a few weeks after the audio versions have been released, and you can see the artworks go by on the video. And I definitely encourage you to check out the ones in this podcast.
Thanks for listening, art enthusiasts.